Abort. Abort the mission. I say again, abort. The desert was on fire. 8 Americans were dead. The hostages were still in Tehran, and the most capable military on Earth had failed in a way that no war game, no contingency annex, no tabletop exercise had predicted. Not because the enemy stopped them, because the weather did, and a hydraulic pump, and a collision in the dark, and a planning gap that nobody had filled because nobody had imagined this specific sequence of failures in this specific order. This is Operation Eagle Claw, April 24th to 25th, 1980. The mission that did not happen, the failure that created the Special Operations Forces America relies on today. The 8 men who died so that the next generation of operators would not. To understand what Eagle Claw required and why it failed, you have to understand the crisis it was trying to resolve. On November 4th, 1979, Iranian students seizing the American embassy in Tehran did not act spontaneously. They acted with the explicit endorsement of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, whose Islamic Revolution had toppled the Shah of Iran 8 months earlier, and who saw the ongoing American diplomatic presence in Tehran as a threat to the consolidation of revolutionary power. The Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, had fled Iran in January 1979. He had been admitted to the United States in October 1979 for cancer treatment. The students demanded his return to Iran for trial. Khomeini endorsed the seizure of the embassy and the holding of 66 American diplomatic personnel as leverage. The crisis was not simply diplomatic, it was existential for Carter's presidency. Carter had built his political identity around competence and integrity after the corruption of the Nixon years. He was a former Navy nuclear engineer who prided himself on understanding the technical details of complex problems. He was a deeply religious man who believed in the power of reason and negotiation to resolve conflict. None of that mattered to Khomeini. Khomeini was not operating within the framework of international norms and diplomatic reciprocity that Carter's approach assumed as its foundation. The hostage crisis was not a negotiating position to be resolved through pressure and concession. It was a demonstration intended for the Iranian domestic audience and the wider Muslim world that the Islamic Revolution could humiliate the most powerful nation on earth and survive. Carter exhausted every diplomatic instrument available. He froze Iranian assets in American banks. He imposed economic sanctions. He broke diplomatic relations. He pursued negotiation through back channels involving Algerian and German intermediaries. He obtained UN Security Council resolutions. He made personal appeals to foreign leaders who might have influence with Tehran. Nothing moved. By December 1979, 6 weeks after the seizure, Carter had authorized military planning for a rescue operation. The plan that the Joint Chiefs developed was the most operationally complex special operation ever attempted by the American military. The fundamental problem was geography. The American embassy in Tehran sat 650 miles from any point from which an assault force could launch without entering Iranian airspace or territory. Carrier-based aircraft, the Navy's strike aircraft on USS Nimitz in the Gulf of Oman, could reach Tehran but could not loiter, could not land to offload operators, and could not carry the number of people needed for an assault on a fortified compound. The only way to put an assault force in Tehran was helicopters. Helicopters had a range problem. The RH-53D Sea Stallion, the largest helicopter in the American inventory at the time, operated by the Navy for minesweeping, had a combat radius of approximately 600 miles with maximum fuel. Tehran was 650 miles from the carrier force. The solution was a staged operation with a desert refueling point. The plan, built by Colonel Charlie Beckwith and his planning team over 3 months, was structured in 4 phases. Phase 1. 8 RH-53D Sea Stallions launch from USS Nimitz in the Gulf of Oman. They fly 600 miles at low altitude, below Iranian radar coverage, to a point in the central Iranian desert, designated Desert 1. 6 C-130 Hercules aircraft, launched from Masira Island in Oman, land at Desert 1 carrying Delta Force operators, support personnel, and jet fuel. Phase 2. Helicopters refuel. Delta operators transfer from C-130s to helicopters. The column flies 265 miles northwest to a concealed hiding site designated Desert 2, outside Tehran, arriving before dawn. All aircraft and personnel remain concealed through the daylight hours. Phase 3. Second night. CIA assets, officers and contractors who had been living covertly in Tehran for weeks, drive trucks carrying the operators from Desert 2 into the city. 2 assault teams hit simultaneously the main embassy compound and the Foreign Ministry building, where 3 additional American diplomats were held separately. Hostages are moved to a nearby soccer stadium. Helicopters land in the stadium. Everyone boards and lifts off. Phase 4 helicopter column flies to the airfield at Manzarieh, 50 miles southwest of Tehran. Rangers, dropped by C-130 in a concurrent airborne operation, have seized the airfield. C-141. Starlifters fly everyone out of Iranian airspace. The minimum number of helicopters required at Desert 1 for the mission to proceed was 6. 6 were needed to carry the operators and the hostages from Tehran to Manzarieh with adequate payload margin. 8 were launched. The safety margin was 2. Beckwith had pushed for more. More helicopters meant larger radar cross-section, more chance of detection on the inbound leg, more complicated coordination at Desert 1. The political and military leadership held the number at 8. The man who commanded Delta Force, who built it, was Charlie Beckwith himself. His career traced from rural Georgia through Korea through a year as an exchange officer with the British Special Air Service. That year with the SAS transformed his understanding of what special operations could be. The SAS operated on the principle that a small number of rigorously selected, broadly trained, independently operating individuals could accomplish what no mass formation could match. Beckwith came back from the SAS and spent 15 years fighting institutional resistance to build the American equivalent. The Army's instinct was for standardized units executing standardized doctrine. Beckwith's argument was for exceptional individuals operating with judgment and flexibility. He fought the bureaucracy until 1977, when Delta Force was formally established. By 1980, Delta had been selecting and training operators for 3 years. Eagle Claw was to be their first combat operation. On the night of April 24, 1980, the operation launched. The C-130s flew from Masira to Desert 1 without incident. They arrived on time. They landed on the desert road that served as the landing zone. They positioned the fuel. They waited for the helicopters. The helicopters launched from Nimitz into darkness and headed north. The first thing that went wrong was invisible. A haboob is a desert meteorological phenomenon, a dense cloud of suspended fine particulate, dust so fine it behaves more like fluid than solid, lifted from the desert surface by strong winds and held in suspension by thermal convection. Unlike a sandstorm, which involves sand particles heavy enough to fall quickly, haboob particles can remain suspended for hours and extend to altitudes of thousands of feet. They cannot be seen on radar. They cannot be navigated around because they are invisible until you are inside them. Inside a haboob at night, at low altitude, over featureless terrain, the experience for a pilot is complete disorientation. No horizon, no ground reference, no visual cues of any kind. The attitude instruments say which direction is up. Every other sense disagrees. The helicopter formation flew into 2 haboob regions on the inbound leg. Helicopter 6 lost its gyroscope inside the haboob. The gyroscope is the primary attitude reference instrument for instrument flight. Without it, sustained night flight at low altitude over featureless terrain is not possible safely. The crew made the correct call. They landed in the desert, declared the aircraft non-mission capable, and waited. They were eventually recovered. Helicopter 5 encountered the haboob and its pilot, a Marine captain, assessed the conditions as unsafe for continuation. His hydraulic warning light had also illuminated, adding to his concern about the aircraft's airworthiness. He turned back toward Nimitz. He did not establish communication with the mission command element before turning back. He believed he was making the right call for his crew. He was not wrong in the abstract. He did not know he was the second aircraft loss in a mission with a 2-aircraft margin. Helicopter 2 navigated around the Haboob by flying a longer route and arrived at Desert 1 90 minutes behind schedule. At Desert 1, Beckwith counted. 6 helicopters had arrived, exactly the minimum. Then, Helicopter 2's pilot reported that the primary hydraulic system had been showing degraded pressure for most of the flight. The system was still functioning, but it was failing. The aviation commanders assessed the aircraft as not safely mission-capable for Phase 2, another 265 miles of low-level flight, a full day concealed in the desert, and the extraction from Tehran. 5 mission-capable helicopters. The minimum was 6. Beckwith established communications with the chain of command. General David Jones, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was in the White House Situation Room. President Carter was present. Beckwith stated the situation. 5 operational helicopters, 6 required, mission abort recommended. Carter authorized the abort within 60 seconds. The abort procedure at Desert 1 was the administrative process of shutting down a complex military operation in the middle of a desert that was not supposed to have anyone in it. The C-130s needed to clear the landing zone. The helicopters needed to reposition and configure for the return flight. The operators needed to reboard the C-130s. This process had never been rehearsed. The individual components of Eagle Claw had been trained separately and to high standards. The Delta assault element had rehearsed the embassy compound assault hundreds of times in a full-scale mock-up. The helicopter crews had rehearsed the long-range low-altitude flight profile. The C-130 crews had rehearsed the Desert 1 landing and fuel transfer. The integrated operation, all components working together in sequence from launch through abort, had never been run as a complete rehearsal. The abort procedures, the specific sequence of actions, the ground guide positioning, the aircraft taxi sequences, had never been formalized into a procedure that crews had practiced. At Desert 1, in the dark, in residual dust from the Haboob, with multiple aircraft needing to coordinate movements in a confined area with no established procedure, a Sea Stallion helicopter maneuvering to clear a taxiway path for a C-130 came too close to the C-130 as it taxied past. The helicopter's rotor struck the C-130's fuselage. Both aircraft ignited simultaneously. The C-130 carried jet fuel for the helicopter resupply. The helicopter carried its own fuel load. Both ignited in the same moment. 8 men died in the fire. Technical Sergeant John Harvey, Staff Sergeant Dewey Johnson, Staff Sergeant George Holmes, and Sergeant Joel Mayo of the Army, Technical Sergeant Harold Lewis, Technical Sergeant Lynn McIntosh, Staff Sergeant Charles McMillan, and Captain Richard Bax of the Air Force. The surviving crews and operators boarded the remaining C-130s and departed. 5 Sea Stallion helicopters, operational, fueled, armed, were left on the desert floor. The classified mission planning documents aboard the helicopters were not destroyed before departure. The next morning, Iranian television showed burning American aircraft, dead Americans, classified documents, and Ayatollah Khomeini declaring the failure evidence of divine intervention against the American Satan. Carter addressed the nation. His words were measured. His political position was beyond recovery. The hostages remained in captivity for 444 days total. They crossed into American-held territory on January 20th, 1981, at the exact moment Ronald Reagan completed his inaugural oath. Carter was already on a plane to Georgia. The Holloway Commission, the post-mission review board convened immediately after Eagle Claw, produced findings that structured American Special Operations Forces for the next 4 decades. The command architecture was wrong. Eagle Claw was assembled from components of different services: Army Delta Force, Navy and Marine helicopter crews, Air Force transport aviation, under a command structure built specifically for this mission, rather than maintained over time as a standing joint force. There was no unified commander with authority over all elements. The services used different radios, different procedures, and different risk assessment standards. Critical information, specifically the helicopter status reports, did not flow reliably between the aircraft crews, the mission commander on the ground, and the chain of command in Washington. The pilot of Helicopter 5 who turned back was applying Navy aviation safety standards appropriate for peacetime naval aviation. The mission required a different risk calculus. That different standard had not been clearly established and agreed to before launch. The training and rehearsal were inadequate. Individual components were trained. The integrated whole was not. Most critically, the abort procedure, arguably the most important contingency in any complex operation, had never been practiced. The communications architecture was insufficient for the mission's requirements. And above all, there was no standing organization responsible for planning, training, equipping, and executing joint special operations as a permanent mission. The Commission recommended creating one. Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, was established in December 1980. Building it was slow and difficult. The services that had contributed forces to Eagle Claw were not enthusiastic about an organization that would place a joint commander above their own authority over their forces. Institutional resistance was sustained and creative. The Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act of 1986 overrode that resistance. It restructured the entire American military command system around joint operations and gave JSOC the legal authority and budget to build the integrated force the Holloway Commission had recommended. The 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, was created specifically to provide dedicated aviation for special operations, trained to standards no conventional helicopter unit could meet and would never be required to meet. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6, was created to provide maritime direct action capability calibrated to the requirements of denied area missions. The training regimen the JSOC developed, full mission profile rehearsals, integrated multi-service exercises, standardized communications procedures across all elements, was built specifically to eliminate the gaps that had opened at Desert 1. For 31 years, the force was built and tested. On May 1st to 2nd, 2011, the force conducted Operation Neptune Spear. 23 operators, 2 modified stealth helicopters, 38 minutes at a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. The differences between Eagle Claw and Neptune Spear are the direct product of what happened in the Iranian desert on April the 24th, 1980. Full mission rehearsal at a classified facility using a scale model of the target. Abort criteria defined and agreed to before launch. Communications architecture tested and verified across all elements. Single command authority with clear responsibility from launch to exfil. Aviation from a unit trained specifically for this mission type. Every contingency, including the helicopter crash that happened at Neptune Spear, when a stealth Black Hawk's tail rotor caught the compound wall on approach, planned for in advance. The stealth Black Hawk crash at Abbottabad was handled in stride. The assault element was unhurt. The operation continued without pause. 38 minutes later, Osama bin Laden was dead. It was handled in stride because 30 years of doctrine, training, and organizational reform had built a force that knew what to do when the unexpected happened, because the unexpected had been wargamed, rehearsed, and planned for until it was no longer unexpected. That force was built from the ashes of Desert 1. It was built from the deaths of Harvey and Johnson and Holmes and Mayo and Lewis and McIntosh and McMillan and Baca. 8 men went to the Iranian desert to bring 66 people home. They did not come home. The organization built from their failure brought the man who ordered the September 11th attacks to justice 31 years later. That is the specific arithmetic of institutional reform driven by catastrophic failure. It is not comfort, it is truth. You know where to find us. Here is what the Holloway Commission found and why those findings shaped 4 decades of American military capability. The Commission examined Eagle Claw across every dimension: the planning process, the training and rehearsal, the command architecture, the equipment selection, the communications procedures, and the specific decisions made during the execution that led to the catastrophe at Desert 1. The first finding was about command authority. Eagle Claw was assembled from pieces of 5 different military components: Army Delta Force, Navy helicopter crews, Marine helicopter crews, Air Force transport aviation, and CIA paramilitary assets. Each of these components had its own chain of command. Each operated under its own regulations, its own risk standards, its own procedures. The mission was commanded by Beckwith on the ground, but Beckwith did not have unified command authority over the helicopter crews. The helicopter crews answered to their own chains of command, Navy and Marine, which operated under peacetime aviation safety regulations that had not been modified for this mission's risk requirements. This produced the most consequential specific failure: the pilot of Helicopter 5, who turned back. That pilot was a Marine officer operating under Marine Corps aviation safety standards. Those standards, applied to a peacetime training flight or a peacetime deployment, would have supported his decision. The hydraulic warning indication combined with the severe instrument conditions of the Haboob constituted a legitimate basis for turning back under normal standards. But Eagle Claw was not a normal mission. It had not been designed with normal peacetime risk standards. The entire architecture of the mission, its timing, its routing, its objective, required accepting risks that normal operations would not accept. Those modified risk standards had to be established, agreed to, and clearly communicated to every element of the force before launch. The pilot of Helicopter 5 had not been clearly told what the acceptable risk threshold was for this specific mission. He applied the standard he knew. He turned back. The Commission's second finding was about rehearsal. The components of Eagle Claw had been rehearsed individually and to high standards. The Delta assault element had practiced the embassy takedown hundreds of times in a full-scale mock-up built at a classified facility. The embassy layout, the guard positions, the timing sequences, all of it had been practiced until it was automatic. The helicopter crews had rehearsed the 600-mile low-level flight profile multiple times. The C-130 crews had rehearsed the Desert 1 landing and the fuel transfer. What had not been rehearsed was the integration. The first time all components of the mission operated together in sequence: helicopters and C-130s and Delta operators and CIA assets all operating from the same plan at the same time, was the operation itself. The specific failure this produced was the abort procedure. When the abort decision was made at Desert 1, the movement of aircraft in the confined landing area was uncoordinated because the procedure for that movement had never been established, written down, or practiced. The ground guide positions, the people who would stand with light wands to guide aircraft taxi movements in the dark, had not been assigned and positioned for the abort scenario. The taxi sequences, which aircraft moved first, which waited, which direction each turned, had not been established. When the helicopters needed to reposition and the C-130s needed to clear, the movements were improvised in darkness and dust. One improvised movement killed 8 men. The Commission's third finding was about communications. The different service components of Eagle Claw operated on different radio networks with different procedures. The communication between the helicopter crews and the ground element, and between the ground element and the command chain in Washington, was not a unified system. It was a collection of different systems that had been connected for this specific mission without the integration testing that would have revealed the gaps. Critical information, the helicopter status reports, the Haboob encounters, the decisions made by individual pilots about continuing or aborting, did not always flow to the people who needed it in time to affect decisions. The fourth and most significant finding was structural. There was no organization in the American military responsible for planning, training, equipping, and executing joint special operations as a standing mission. Delta Force existed, the Ranger battalions existed, the Air Force Special Operations Squadrons existed, but they were administratively separate. They had different chains of command. They trained to different standards. They had no permanent joint command structure, no common communications architecture, and no shared doctrine for integrated operations. They had never trained together as an integrated force because no organization existed to require and coordinate that training. Eagle Claw was the first time most of these elements had operated together. The Commission recommended creating a permanent joint command for special operations, with the authority and the resources to build a genuinely integrated force that trained together, exercised together, and could execute together when called upon. Joint Special Operations Command was established in December 1980. The first years of JSOC were difficult. The services that had contributed to Eagle Claw were not enthusiastic about a joint command that would place a commander above their own authority over their forces. Institutional resistance was inventive and sustained. Budgets were constrained. Key positions were filled with officers who saw JSOC as a career dead end, rather than the central instrument of American military power that the Holloway Commission had envisioned. The Goldwater-Nichols Defense Reorganization Act of 1986 changed the institutional reality. Goldwater-Nichols was the most comprehensive reform of the American military command system since the National Security Act of 1947. It restructured every major command relationship in the armed forces around joint operations, requiring officers to serve in joint assignments to be promoted, requiring services to provide forces to joint commanders with full operational authority, and eliminating many of the service parochialisms that had made joint operations like Eagle Claw so difficult to coordinate. The Act gave JSOC what it needed: legal authority over multi-service special operations forces, a dedicated budget, and the ability to establish joint training requirements that all participating services had to meet. What was built over the following 2 decades was unlike anything in the American military's previous history. The 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, grew from a small classified unit into a full regiment with standardized selection, training, and equipment. Their standard became 45 feet and 30 seconds. The ability to place a helicopter within 45 feet of a designated point anywhere in their operating area within 30 seconds of the planned time, in any weather, in any visibility, in the presence of hostile fire. They trained to that standard continuously. They were measured against it in every exercise. When they could not meet it, they trained until they could. Naval Special Warfare Development Group, SEAL Team 6, was established in October 1980, 6 months after Eagle Claw, specifically to provide a maritime direct action capability with the security procedures, the training standards, and the operational protocols that Eagle Claw had demonstrated were necessary. DevGRU, as it became known, was from the beginning a counter-terrorism and direct action force calibrated specifically for the kind of mission Eagle Claw had attempted. The joint training architecture that JSOC developed required all components: aviation, ground assault, fire support, intelligence, to train together in integrated exercises before any operation was approved to execute. Full mission profile rehearsals at classified facilities using scale models or actual mock-ups of target structures became standard practice for any complex operation. The communications architecture was rebuilt from the ground up. Common radios, common procedures, common signal operating instructions across all components of any JSOC task force. The information gaps that had contributed to the decisions made by Helicopter 5's pilot, decisions made without full knowledge of the mission's status, could not be allowed to exist in the force that JSOC was building. It took 31 years. On May 1st to 2nd, 2011, JSOC executed Operation Neptune Spear. 2 modified stealth Black Hawk helicopters carrying 23 operators flew from Jalalabad, Afghanistan, into Pakistani airspace without Pakistani knowledge or consent. They flew 49 minutes in Pakistani territory. They landed at a compound in Abbottabad, 35 miles north of Islamabad. During the landing approach, one of the stealth Black Hawks lost lift due to hot gas recirculation in the enclosed compound walls and crash-landed at a controlled angle that kept the crew and operators safe. The crash was handled without a pause in the operation, because it had been planned for, because every significant contingency, including the loss of a helicopter at the objective, had been war-gamed, rehearsed, and procedures developed to handle it. The backup helicopter repositioned. The assault element continued. 38 minutes after first landing, Osama bin Laden was dead, and the force was exfiltrating. Total time in Pakistani airspace, 49 minutes. Bin Laden was identified by facial recognition and DNA within 90 minutes of the helicopters returning to Afghanistan. The operation worked because the force that executed it had been built, specifically, deliberately, with the failures of April 24, 1980, as the explicit blueprint for what not to repeat. Over the course of 31 years, 8 men died at Desert One. The force built from their deaths killed the man responsible for September 11th. That arithmetic is not comfort. The families of Technical Sergeant Harvey, Staff Sergeant Johnson, Staff Sergeant Holmes, Sergeant Mayo, Technical Sergeant Lewis, Technical Sergeant McIntosh, Staff Sergeant McMillan, and Captain Baca did not need a lesson in institutional reform. They needed their men home. But the history is the history. Eagle Claw failed for specific identifiable reasons. Those reasons were examined, documented, and translated into organizational change. The change produced a force. The force did what Eagle Claw could not. Every special operation the United States has successfully conducted since 1980, every hostage rescue, every direct action, every night raid, every mission behind enemy lines, has been conducted by a force built from the specific lessons of that failure. That is what it means when military professionals say you learn more from failure than from success. You know where to find us. There is one more detail that deserves to be said, and it is about the men who did not die at Desert One. The operators who walked back to those C-130s, Delta Force soldiers who had trained for months for the assault on the embassy, who had drilled the breach sequence and the room clearing and the hostage extraction until they could do it in total darkness, flew out of Iran that night knowing they had not done the one thing they were there to do. They had not gone to the embassy. They had not gotten the hostages. They had not done the mission. They flew out of the Iranian desert with the knowledge that 66 Americans were still in that compound in Tehran, and that the force that was supposed to go get them had turned around in the desert without firing a shot at the enemy. Beckwith was asked later about that flight. He said he spent most of it trying to figure out what he would have done differently, what decision, made differently, would have changed the outcome. He concluded eventually that the decisions made at Desert One were the right decisions given the situation at Desert One. 5 helicopters was not 6 helicopters. 6 was the minimum. The abort was correct. The decisions that led to 5 operational helicopters at Desert One, the margin of 2 instead of 4, the absence of a full integrated rehearsal, the communication gaps, those were the decisions that deserved examination. They received it. Beckwith spent the last years of his career documenting the lessons of Eagle Claw and advocating for the organizational changes the Holloway Commission had recommended. He retired in 1981. He spent his remaining years watching the force he had built become what he had always argued the Army needed it to be. He died in 1994, 14 years before the force he built killed bin Laden. He knew it was capable of it. You know where to find us. The 444 days that the hostages spent in captivity were not simply a humanitarian crisis. They were a slow-motion demonstration of American institutional limits, of what a superpower cannot do when the instrument of force does not fit the problem. Diplomacy could not compel a revolutionary government that regarded martyrdom as a political asset. Economic sanctions could not compel a government that had already broken with the international economic system. Military force at scale, an invasion of Iran, was not politically feasible and would have killed the hostages before it succeeded. The only instrument that fit the problem was a small, precise, capable special operations force that could go into a hostile city, extract 66 people under fire, and disappear. America did not have that instrument in April 1980. It had the pieces. Delta Force was real. The Rangers were real. The helicopter units were real. But the pieces had never been assembled into an integrated force. The joints between them, the communications, the training, the command authority, the common procedures had not been built. Desert One demonstrated the cost of those missing joints. The cost was 8 men and the presidency of Jimmy Carter. The lesson was specific enough to act on. The failures were documented. The required reforms were identified. An organization was created to implement them. 31 years later, the integrated force produced by those reforms executed a mission of comparable complexity. A nighttime helicopter raid into a sovereign country without that country's knowledge or consent, against a compound in a city, extracting a dead man rather than living hostages, but requiring the same basic capability. And it worked. It worked in 38 minutes. Carter had carried the photograph of the hostages in his breast pocket every day of the 444 days. He met them when they returned. He stood on the tarmac and shook each hand and said whatever it is appropriate to say to a person who has been a prisoner for more than a year, because the instrument that should have rescued them was not ready. The force that was eventually built, the force that Eagle Claw's failure demanded into existence, has rescued hostages, killed terrorists, disrupted networks, and projected American power into denied areas in operations that the public mostly does not know about and that the people involved mostly do not discuss. That force exists because 8 men went to the Iranian desert and did not come back. Their names deserve to be read aloud, not as a footnote to an institutional story, but as the human cost of the gap between what a military claims to be capable of and what it is actually capable of when the test arrives. Technical Sergeant John Harvey, Staff Sergeant Dewey Johnson, Staff Sergeant George Holmes, Sergeant Joel Mayo, Technical Sergeant Harold Lewis, Technical Sergeant Lynn McIntosh, Staff Sergeant Charles McMillan, Captain Richard Bach. 8 men, 444 days. 1 mission. You know where to find us. Note to reader, 8 dead. 444 days. 1 mission that changed everything that came after it. You know where to find us.